This component focuses on the human dependencies on environmental flows through the ecosystem services ecosystem provides for society. The unit has 4 components. We will first discuss what ecosystem services are that people use of ecosystems. Then I will give some examples of impact of river regulation on communities downstream of river regulations. I will tell something about monetary valuation of ecosystem services and about the importance of services for human well-being. The learning objectives are written here. Firstly, understand the different types of services ecosystems provide for society. Secondly, be aware that all changes in the water resources system are meant to increase availability of certain services, and that this will necessarily be at the loss of other services, which may increase inequality in the basin since access to services by various stakeholders can then shift. And lastly, understand the positive and negative aspects of monetary valuation for including ecosystem services and environmental flows in water resources management. Okay, what are ecosystem services? Ecosystem services are all things, all services that people use as ecosystems for. So, for example, people may depend on fisheries for their livelihoods. They may grow crops in floodplains, but also they may collect products from the ecosystem such as honey or fuel or timber wood or reeds for roofs and various other products. But it's not only products people take from ecosystems. Ecosystems can also play a role in regulating the local climate. For example, if there's a wetland or a river or there's vegetation, water evaporates, and through this evaporation, the temperature is kind of regulated, the humidity is regulated, and that affects the microclimate in the area. This picture is a picture of a village in a desert area close to a wetland. And when the wetland has water, the water evaporates and the wind blows droplets of water into the village, cooling the air as a kind of natural air conditioner. But in this case, the wetland had been dry for about 7 years. And when the wetland is dry and the same winds blow into the village, it only brings dust and hot air. And the living climate in the village completely changed for the people. They at once had to deal, instead of a nice cool area near a wetland, it was a very hot and dry climate. And also wetlands and other ecosystems can provide a scene for ceremonies, for religious ceremonies, to celebrate traditions. So wetlands and other ecosystems also play a role in cultural activities of people. So we generally distinguish 3 categories of ecosystem services. So the first are the provisioning services. That refers to all the tangible products people take from ecosystems like fish, but also water or wood. Secondly, regulating services, like I just mentioned, the regulation of climate, but wetlands can also attenuate floods, or wetlands can play a role in purifying water through their natural purification capacities. Third one are the cultural services, for which I just mentioned the scene for celebrating traditions, but also religious or spiritual activities can take place in ecosystems. And a fourth category are the supporting services, and that refers to, for example, nutrient cycling or other processes within the ecosystem that are necessary for the other ecosystem services to be there. So the supporting services support the other ecosystem services. And these services are used by people in different ways. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment distinguishes a number of components of human well-being, such as security, use of materials for a good life, health, and also good social relations, which are mainly related to the cultural activities. And these well-being components can also reinforce each other, because when you have no good health, you can also not provide a good income, and your health may even further decrease. So the well-being components are also related. And what the arrows in the diagram show is that different services contribute to various of those human well-being components. So there are many interrelations here. Some examples of wetlands and river ecosystems that provide services for large groups of people. One is the Niger Inland Delta in Mali. In this inland delta, annually an area of 30,000 square kilometers is flooded, and that provides a habitat for about 350 species of birds and many species of fish. But also it provides the services for 500,000 people who live in this area and who depend on these services for their livelihoods. For example, large groups of people make use of the inundated wetland for catching fish. Other people, when the floods recede, use the floodplains to grow crops. And again, other people come with their cattle and make use of the grassland surrounding the lakes. Another example is the Sundarban area in Bangladesh. The Sundarban area is a large mangrove area of 6,000 square kilometers, and that Sundarban area depends on freshwater inflows from the Gorai, which is an offtake of the Ganges, to maintain low salinity levels. If salinity levels would increase, it would still be a mangrove area, but it will have a different type of mangrove, and especially the mangroves that are now provide a very important type of timber wood. So many people in Bangladesh depend on this wood harvesting of the type of mangroves that grow in this area now. And also honey collection and fishing are important products that people use. So also here, the Sundarban not only provides an important habitat for animals, for example for the Royal Bengal tiger that lives there, but also millions of Bangladeshi depend on this area. Well, actually the whole global population depends in the end on services provided by ecosystems. So these changes in ecosystem services through river regulation actually concern all, but in this unit we focus on the communities that depend directly on these ecosystems for their livelihood and well-being. And actually those impacts have not been documented much. Some examples are the Manantali Dam in Senegal, where reduced floods led to a decrease in production of recession agriculture in the floodplains, or the Maga Dam in Cameroon, where regulation led to reduced yields from fishing in the Lagone floodplain, and floodplain-dependent pasturage actually had to migrate. Well, the most influential in this regard is perhaps the report from the World Commission on Dams in 2000. The World Commission on Dams estimated that worldwide millions of people are dependent directly on the services provided to them by rivers and wetlands and estuaries, and that river regulation has affected many of these people. More recently, Brian Richter and others indicated that 472 million people have their livelihoods threatened by regulation through dams. So, what does this mean? Does it mean that we should no longer build dams for hydropower generation and no longer irrigate agricultural land? Well, I don't think that should be the case, because the world needs sustainable energy and we need to produce food. I think what is most important is to realize that when you build dams and when you irrigate agriculture areas, What you actually do is you make certain services, ecosystem services, more available. For example, the potential of the ecosystem to generate hydropower. So those services are increased, but at the same time there are other services which availability is decreased. And all those intervention in a river basin will always lead to a shift in availability of ecosystem services. And because different groups of people depend on hydropower generation and irrigation, and other groups of people depend on the ecosystem services provided by the unregulated river, these shifts in ecosystem services will also lead to a shift in access of people to these services. So some people will benefit and other people will lose. And I think what is most important is to understand how these shifts take place and who benefits and who loses, so that an informed decision can be made on whether or not to make an intervention in the river basin. I think a very relevant statement in this regard is a statement by Peter Watson, a former representative of the World Bank for Africa. Because what he said is that failing to deal with the impacts of ecosystem, of river regulation on the availability of ecosystem services does not make them go away. He said it only distorts the calculation of the economic rate of return of potential investments to the extent that the true costs of the project to the community are not taken into account. And this is not good economics, and it's also not good public decision making. What he says, in fact, is that you just ignore part of your calculation and you're actually misinforming and making a wrong decision on investments if you do not take also those costs into account. Well, I think there are two ways to look at the values of ecosystem services for people. One is through monetary valuation, and the other one is through looking at in what way ecosystem services are important to people. I will first discuss the monetary valuation. And for this monetary valuation, a concept that is often used is the concept of total economic value, which is depicted here in this slide. Total economic valuation is split into use values and non-use values. Use values are again split into direct use values, which are, for example, materials that people use, the actual products that people take, and indirect use values, which are more related to those regulation services. Non-use values refer to values that people attach to ecosystem just because the ecosystem is there, because they appreciate having a good ecosystem. And this can either be now, which is then called the existence value, or in the future, which is referred to as the bequest value. Option values can be either use or non-use values, but are values that are not currently used, but could potentially be used in the future. There are many different ways to provide a monetary value for these ecosystem services. There's actually a whole, a lot of literature on this method, and here I just mentioned a few. For example, the revealed preference method. The revealed preference method is based on prices people actually pay in a market to obtain certain products. Another method is the replacement cost approach. That method looks at what would be the cost of replacing a natural surface. For example, if there is nowadays a wetland which purifies wastewater, and that wetland would no longer be there to achieve the same amount or the same level of purification, one would need to build a wastewater purification plant. So the cost of building that purification plant can then be used as a replacement cost for that wetland. Another example of a method is the stated preference method. That method is often used for valuing cultural services, recreational services, for example, by asking people what they are willing to pay to maintain a certain ecosystem. So sometimes this is done through asking people what they would be willing to pay to travel to a certain natural area, or what they would be willing to pay to access a natural park, for example. Monetary valuation can be very useful, but it also has some drawbacks. What is very useful about monetary valuation is that expressing values in dollars or euros is something that makes the value of ecosystems very easy to understand for decision makers. Everybody understands monetary valuation, and it also makes it more comparable to other alternatives. So this is really the main positive aspect of monetary valuation. The main drawback is that the method to express future values, to translate future values into a present value, applies a discount ratio, which means that values that we will obtain in the future are less worth today. And that makes it difficult when comparing, for example, a purification plant with a wetland. Because for a purification plant, it will have a limited lifetime, for example, of 50 years. So there's only a limited amount of this discounting. But when looking at the wetland may provide the same services for hundreds of years or even longer. But the fact that this wetland has the same value over a very long period is actually lost by using this discounting method. So there is a major drawback which makes it very hard to compare the values of ecosystems to the values of interventions. Another aspect is that the concept says total economic value, but in reality there are many types of services that are really hard to give a monetary value to. So monetary valuation often focuses on a limited number of services and generally on the marketable products. So one should be careful that the valuation that is done is often only a partial value and may not represent the total economic value of an ecosystem service. This slide shows an inventory of different economic values of ecosystem services or of ecosystems found in literature, done by Louise Korska from Denmark. What this slide shows is that for the different services, you see a large range in economic values. So there's a large uncertainty involved in determining the monetary values. It also shows there are large differences between the developed economies and the developing economies. So the monetary values are very useful, but they also concern large uncertainties. But nevertheless, I think if there are no values available for a typical ecosystem, these values can be used very well as a kind of first assessment of what potentially the value of the ecosystem could be. And then it would be very good to use both the lower and the higher value to actually show a range of monetary values for that ecosystem service. Okay, so far the economic valuation. Another part is to look not at economic values, but to focus on in what way the ecosystem services are important in people's life. To see how services contribute to human well-being. And human well-being I define here as everything important to people's life in their own perception, so this can be many different things. And it's useful to split that concept in a number of components, like, for example, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment did by distinguishing security, basic materials, health, or social relations. And I think the first step in considering how ecosystem services are important to people is by looking at what different groups of people live in the area that are likely to be affected differently when ecosystem services change. And groups of people can be distinguished, for example, based on their income-generating activities. Some people will depend on catching fish, while others maybe depend on agriculture in recession areas. But other characteristics based on which we can distinguish different groups. Could be age, or gender, or the ethnic group that people belong to. And then to answer the question of how important are services for human well-being, I think we need to answer 3 questions. How do services contribute to human well-being? In what way do people make use of those services? How vulnerable are people's livelihoods to changes in these services? Do they have access? Are there alternatives? And thirdly, when these changes take place, do people have the ability to recover from changes in the ecosystem? Well, I will discuss those 3 questions in the following slides. So to start with, how people make use of the services, and do they actually have access to the services? For example, if there are local power relationships in an area, this may prevent certain groups of people from using those services. And this was, for example, the case in Bangladesh, where the more traditional fishermen, who were the poorest people, were not allowed to fish in certain stretches of the river that were fenced off by more powerful people. So even when the services are there, not everybody may be able to make use of those services. Another question is, are ecosystem services perhaps not the only source of income? Generally, poorer people diversify their livelihood strategies, and they may make use of various sources of income. This was, for example, the case in the Sistan Inland Delta in Iran. About 70,000 people live in that area, and about 20% of the people depended for more than 70% of their income on wetland-related activities. Another 40% depended for more than 70% of their income on activities related to irrigation. And another 40% did not in the first place depend on water-related income strategies. So I think it's good to look at those, to what extent wetland or environmental flow related activities provide income, and to what extent people have other sources of income. Then last question is, do people have the ability to recover from those changes in availability? Are they able to find alternatives? Will they perhaps receive help from family members or from government? And what we saw in the Hamoon wetlands in Iran was when those wetlands were dry for a period of 7 years, some help was provided. The government constructed a pipeline to supply drinking water to people's house. Also, basic food items were provided as a kind of emergency help. But this was not enough for everybody. Many families moved away to other areas in Iran to set up a new life. And other people who stayed but were not able to generate sufficient income had to resort to smuggling and illegal activities. And although they told us that that was sufficient to sustain their livelihoods, it did affect their well-being because they felt insecure and they were not happy with this new way of life. So to summarize this unit, this was all about ecosystems, which are ecosystem services which are provided by ecosystems to society. And I think what's very important to remember is that water management strategies will generally result in a shift of the availability of ecosystem services. Some services will be available more abundantly, while others may, for other services, the availability may decrease. And what is especially important is who has access to these services and how this access will also shift. And both monetary valuation and considering the importance of services for livelihoods and well-being are useful ways to provide more insight in exactly how humans are dependent on ecosystem services. And only with this information can a balanced decision in water resources management be made. Okay, thank you.